We now have approximately 30 minutes for discussing all of the papers. So that is to remind us, the paper by Professor Zamagni, the paper by Professor Reimers, by our colleagues from UNICEF, and Professor Caffo's presentation. So I leave it open now for questions and comments and suggestions. So I have a question, more of a question. I'll present an issue. So for a decade, I was a dean in the west coast of the United States. And I came to know firsthand some of the architects of these new social media platforms and technologies. And here is the paradox. They would not let their children have iPhones, iPads, laptops. And this was given to me because of the responsibilities I had running a network of schools, including research schools and experimental schools. And one of the themes that surfaced was the following. Again, these are the architects of these platforms. They were purposefully devised for their addictive properties. Giddens, I think in the Fifth lectures, argues that the malaise of the movement from pre-modernity to modernity ushers the emergence of the obsessive-compulsive disorders as the malaise of our times, as we move away from the ritual ordering of human cultures. So I wonder, Professor Caffo, if you would comment on this. So evidently, these instruments are devised purposefully to addict young minds. That will be the vehicle that will solve the problems we face today? It's a question.
Thank you for the very interesting question. I think that we have now a very interesting situation, and we had a few days ago a Sefer Internet Day meeting, and we discussed about, in this case was a meeting in Bocconi, where we speak between economist, engineer, sociologist and psychiatrist, what will be the future of the digital world for children. In this case, we have to say that the company work now in the area of data. The data of children are crucial. What happens is that technology now is able to understand very well what we have in our personal experience, all the data of when we are born or in the hand or to before of the big company, and they can decide through the algorithm what can be our behavior. And all the data can be utilized to control the future of our children in some way. And I think this is a big issue, the fact that sometimes the dependency of many children to the technological instrument depends of the system that they use. When, in particular, one area that we have now in the experience of the children is the gaming area. In the gaming area, you're dependent from the game that you're utilizing. And the gaming company know very well the data of the behavior of the person, in particular children and adolescents. And their products work very well if they are able to maintain the child in the system. To use the data is for them a crucial area to collect resource, economic resource, because the system of the data, of the big data, is a system which more data you have, more money you can have. This is a way which we have to discuss how we have to work with the company to discuss this issue. Because to protect children means that we have to see how can be the best solution in the interest of the children. I think that now we don't have any control of this system. Only Europe tried in the last years with the GDPR, with other systems to have more control. For example, one issue is the age verification topic. The fact that the children can enter in any place without any control. And as you know, we have many risky places where the children can go. For example, the pornographic site, where they can enter and they can use all the material that is there. And without any rules in this area of child age verification, it's impossible to block this kind of situation. I think now we have to see how we can work more with company, with institutions to face this problem. This is a big issue, I think. And the issue of algorithms that control our behavior is a crucial issue.
Thank you so much, Professor Caffo. Professor Zamagni, also I want to remind you that we have colleagues on line, on the Zoom, that they can ask questions. So, Professor Zamagni, then Carola.
Thank you. Not being a member of this invisible college, because I'm an economist, I would be happy to hear the reaction in particular of Fernando and Gunilla, but also to the others, to the following question. I never heard so far the use of the word connection. What do you think about that? Connection, it's, by the way, a word which was coined by Aristotle 2,400 years. And in recent times, it has attracting a lot of attention. Do you believe that is just a mode, a fashion, something like that, or there is a substance in it? And connected to that, what do you think about the future of the flipped class initiative or experiments? Do you think again, they started, if I'm correct, in the States, well, I don't remember the state, but it is spreading. Do you think that this represents a real alternative from a pedagogical point of view to the usual way of carrying on classes? And finally, in a few years ago, Edgar Morin, he gave a lecture or a seminar after publication a small book, the title which is Pollicina. That is the Italian title. And in that book, which was initially published in French, Ed Morin says that there is no way that the adult generation, our generation, can understand the children. In other words, can provide an answer to the question, what is the future of our children in a digitalized society? Why? Because our frame of mind of the adult people is totally qualitatively different. In other words, for an adult, these new technology are a means, are an instrument for enhancing our abilities. But for the children, they are not an instrument. They are part of their world. And so the way that we approach the problem is totally different from that of children. Do you think that this is an argument which deserves attention or not? Because as I said, I am not an expert in the area. But my personal experience having grandchildren, staying with children, I have to realize that they do not read. Their cognitive maps are different from our maps. Because when they are born, in the last few years, they are born already in an algorithmic type of environment, which is not the case to us. Thank you.
Professor Zamagni, could I address the question of the flipped classroom and what we learned about that during the pandemic?
Yes, please.
Yeah, so
Fernando.
I do think that in the studies that we conducted of innovation generated during the pandemic, we learned two things. One, technology does have tremendous potential to allow greater ways of personalization than traditional instruction. And the flipped classroom is one of those examples. Just by the sheer act of recording a lecture and allowing students the possibility of viewing that at a time of their own choosing and at a speed of their own choosing, that alone is a tremendous benefit over a teacher or a professor delivering an explanation at a time of their own choosing and at a speed of their own choosing. But in addition to that, the possibility of creating very rich banks of digital resources allows personalization in a different way, expanding, enriching the curriculum, which is typically available to students. I mean, that's the great discovery of Khan Academy, that you can produce high quality materials and make them available to any child in the world. And in that way, provide that student the opportunity to bypass whatever shortcomings their own teachers have in expertise in an area or not. Having said that, we also learn that there are benefits of the in-person experience from the point of view of social interaction, from the point of view of attending to the social, emotional well-being that we don't know yet how to substitute with online environment. I also think that it should be recognized that the innovations that were generated during the pandemic in using these technologies were generated in a hurry. They were really improvisational acts rather than the result of planful design and engineering. And finally, I think the pandemic showed us not only the potential of these technologies, but also their shortcomings. You may remember that before the pandemic, there were some things that were being said about how technology could replace education that is with hindsight sound really irresponsible. There's a very famous talk that basically says, provide a computer to children in the streets in Mumbai, and they will teach themselves what they know. We now know that the many different circumstances under which children live mean that a child doesn't benefit from technology alone, but with support from others. And some children can get that support at home and others cannot. And so that continues to make a case for the importance of the school. So what I conclude from these 2 years of experimentation is, number one, absolutely, we should be capitalizing on everything that we learn about the potential of these technologies. Second, we should be making much greater investments in developing the capacity of teachers and students to use these technologies properly. And number three, we should be more humble in recognizing that there may be things that the in-person experience can accomplish in terms of socializing the young that we don't yet know whether they can be replaced by other means or whether they should be replaced by other means. But the short answer to your question, the flipped classroom is a phenomenal thing. I've begun to use it in my own teaching at Harvard as a result of what I had to do during the pandemic.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Just one comment. I think about 15 or 20 years ago, no names, the former head of the media lab at MIT came to this very room, and he had a device called the 1 lap per child. And he articulated, Fernando, essentially the claim that you can leave the laptop in Eritrea, in Ethiopia, and the children would teach themselves. And we know how that went. Thank you. We have now Carola, and then we have Daniel. Daniel, in Zoom. Are you with us, Daniel?
Yes, I am.
Daniel, please, your turn.
Thank you so much. I wanted to respond to the very interesting question you posed around what people refer to as addictive properties of technology. This also happens to be the topic I wrote my PhD thesis about, so I'm very interested. I think designers aim to develop technology that children want to use. So a good product is one that is engaging, fascinating, captivating. And those are characteristics that can be seen as contributing to excessive use or addictive use, repeated use. And it also facilitates the form of data collection that Professor Caffo was referring to, which is very good for companies. And these characteristics that lead children to engage perhaps excessively, they're also useful for learning. It facilitates engaging experiences, relaxation, fun. So it's difficult to ask companies to create, in a way, less addictive experiences, because that means they would have to design more boring experiences that no one would use. So this is a real dilemma. And I think the solution to this is actually in what Professor Caffo said, that we need to work more with companies. And my team right now at UNICEF Innocenti, we're working with a Lego group, the brick toy company. And we're engaging in research to basically develop a model for how companies can design digital experiences for children that are more conducive to their well-being, to their learning and their development. And the project really centers on identifying design principles that contribute to positive well-being outcomes and working out how to infuse those into different experiences that children engage in online. And we're engaging in observational and experimental research with children to identify those. And that's a way for us then to influence how companies actually design these experiences that are hopefully more supportive of children's positive development in a way that doesn't affect their bottom line negatively. And one of the things that we keep coming up against is this idea that the design should not be exploitative. It should not contain features that subconsciously lead children to use technology more than they want to, or design that makes it more difficult for children to disconnect or even feel that they want to disconnect. And I think the endlessly scrolling social media feed is an example of that kind of design. But other than that, and just to conclude, I also think it depends a bit on us as adults to teach children how to engage with technology in a responsible way. And I think many adults actually are not so good at that. We also overuse technology, and we have to help children understand when disconnecting would actually be good for them, when it would be beneficial for their health, well-being, or other interests. And I think that's a conversation that we as a society and us as adults need to engage in much more closely, but I don't think we quite know how to do that yet. And I think we don't know that how to do that for ourselves either. So very interesting question. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Thank you so much, Daniel. Carola, and then Father Zollner.
Thank you so much. This question is for Fernando. Fernando, I was intrigued by the silver lining issue that you brought up, and in particular, the book on how learning continued during the COVID pandemic on the 45 case studies. And as a qualitative researcher, I was trying to think of the categories of common denominators that might have occurred across the different case studies, and whether or not there were common denominators. And as I was listening to you, I wrote down some of the things you mentioned, like attention to social emotional learning, the power of collaboration, multiple modalities. And as I was listening to Danielle just now, I was thinking about design principles like engagement and you know, fostering curiosity, that sort of thing. So I was wondering if you could please speak to what you noticed, and if not, that would be a great coding task to give to your students. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carola. You are the best because I can see that you read the paper and you have it in front of you. So thank you. And I only sent it to you yesterday. My fault. Yes, I do think that there were a number of common denominators across the 45 cases. In fact, we drew 11 lessons based on the common denominators, some of which surprised us and others did not. So the ones that didn't surprise us is that they all of these cases made front and center a priority of attending to the social emotional well-being of children. And I think that was the pandemic. That was the reality of the situation, called us to do that. Another common denominator, perhaps an artifact of how we selected the case studies, is all of these organizations had a very clear focus in making sure they reach the most vulnerable kids, which is very different from national case studies that look at how governments do that. In our study of the 13 different countries, only Portugal made attending to the most marginalized things a front and center objective of policy. So that's an interesting study in contrast. The things that we were not expecting to find, but that was a common denominator in these case studies. One is the power of new forms of collaboration to generate these innovations that engage, as I mentioned in the example of Teach for All, people close to the kids. See, these were innovations that in a way illustrated a form of new power. As if you think about old power as the power of governments to produce change from the top and engineering from the top, this was just the opposite. These were people close in the front lines who knew much better what was happening than their governments and who invented solutions as a result of connecting with their peers, connecting with families, connecting with civil societies, and connecting across schools. So there is a story here about the power of technology, not to support instruction, but to support novel forms of organization of people in the front lines that enable them to do things that the old power, that the governments were unable to do at the same speed. And I think that there is a common theme, not in the 45 case studies, but in many of them, of new forms of leadership. That was not something we were expecting to find, but as we wrote these case studies, I began to realize that there was a big story here of how people were leading. And so if I could stylize the facts, because I was during this period in touch with a number of education authorities in this country and elsewhere, trying to be helpful, I could see the responses of some of my colleagues in my state, if I could say that, who, when I reached them and said, how can we help you? Some of them adopt a posture, a stance of, don't worry, we have it figured it out. And that stance went on for a long time. In retrospect, it is clear that it was a defensive mechanism in the face of a situation where, of course, nobody had anything figured out. This was a crisis for which we had no playbook. But some people in positional leadership thought that the best way they could lead was to deceive and to not admit that they needed help. In contrast, in the case studies that generated these innovations, we see the opposite. We see the Secretary of Sao Paulo coming in front of people and saying, I need your help. I don't know what to do, but I am committed to ensuring that we can educate. And we see the Secretary of Bogota doing the same thing. And it is that humble leadership, that vulnerable leadership, that inviting leadership, that inclusive leadership, that opens room, that makes space for these networks of people in the front lines who actually say, well, we have an idea, let's work together. So I do think if you think about organizations as evolving through stages, from a traditional bureaucratic 20th century stage of top-down to a more pluralistic conception, where good ideas can come from anywhere, more collaborative and so on. The pandemic was a moment for some systems or subsystems to experiment a pluralistic form of leading that they hadn't experienced before. And I hope we don't lose the lessons that we could learn from that. And I do think that there are very conservative forces in all of our institutions, including our universities, pulling us back to the bureaucracy of the 20th century, and in a sense, intent in making us forget what we experience at this moment of crisis.
Thank you so much, Fernando. Father Zollner.
Thank you. I just wanted to come back to Daniel's presentation and response in regard to the design. And I wanted to point out that there is the e-safety commissioner of the Australian government, Julie Inman-Grant, who is doing an extremely fine job in promoting this design. They call it safety by design, so that by using the gadgets that we use, there is already a threshold for becoming addicted and so forth. There is also an interesting point for us that we have, we can't count ourselves among the digital natives. In the e-safety commissioner's office, you have, for example, the inclusion of an online safety youth advisory council. So they ask youth how they use it and how they really make sure that we understand, as those who are parents, grandparents, or technicians, or those who have responsibility also in education, what they perceive as the biggest threats to that. So just to underline that there is lots on the way, and we don't need to reinvent the wheel, but just to spread the good work that is already being done.
Thank you so much, Father Zollner. Senator Giannini, and then Dean Jha. You've lost your identity. This is the problem of Ericsson and identity.
Thank you very much. Just a comment to build on some of, first of all, thanks for very, very much inspiring presentations in the afternoon. Fernando, I think, you know, put the finger where the issue is. First, this pandemic has been a real game changer. We already have a legacy, which is about different keywords we are, you know, permanently repeated and built on in our daily activities over the last 2 years. Solidarity, cooperation, collaboration, which actually has been translated in concrete, different way of working. I can mention the UN system, which more than ever, in a very unprecedented way, I mean, I joined UNESCO 4 years ago now, but I understand from my colleagues that this kind of cooperation we are having, for instance, with UNICEF, the World Bank, Save the Children, a lot of different partners within the UN and outside the UN, has been a real new entry in the system. It's about agility. It's about being results-oriented. It's about, since the beginning of the crisis, assuring learning continuity, where digital learning, whatever we see, we like or don't like, has been one of the main drivers and one of the main tools. So now I think that we already unlock the potential of change and technology within change. So I think that the risk I see, honestly, is that we are now just focusing on the negative side, some challenges. I also will mention some of them in my presentation later. But the responsibility we have is not to lose. As soon as the narrative is changing, and we see already this week, you know, COVID is no more at the core of the common debate for reasons which are very much understandable, of course, but I think this is a legacy we have to keep and really to protect, because this has been a game changer, and I think that is something we have to build on. Either we talk of education and really try to address more effectively than ever and in the past all the challenges that have been discussed this morning, or other public sectors like health sector, or mostly, more interestingly, I think, the intersectoral approach we have to keep. I think the interconnected challenges we are facing are very much part of the solution, unless we go back to the business as usual, as some conservative forces are trying a little bit to force or to push for. So I fully, from my experience, agree with Fernando among the others about the hope side and the positive side of this crisis.
Thank you so much. Ashish.
Thank you, and I'm going to build on that last comment, and then I have a quick question as well. I'm reminded, and I think Fernando really got the heart of this as well. I'm reminded of a quotation, and I was trying to quickly look it up when it's from. I want to say it's the early 1990s. A Nobel laureate in economics, Robert Solow, famous line, after the computing revolution had come to American industry and everything was getting digitized, he said, "I see technology everywhere except in the productivity statistics." And his point was that American industry was putting in all this technology and no one could find any benefit of it whatsoever. Well, it turned out that I think most of us believe that in the 10 years that followed that statement, there were massive gains in productivity, because the history of technology, and this will get to the issues around technology and education, the history of technology is when you put it in first, you tend to digitize the old process. Whatever you did in an analog world, you start doing in a digital world. And it's actually not that useful. It's a marginal gain. But at some point, depending on the industry, whether it takes 5 years or 10 years, people start changing the way they work. They start changing how they actually use that technology. And that's when the productivity gains come. And it's interesting to me that the two industries that have been slowest to be influenced and shaped by the technology revolution are healthcare and education. And we can speculate on why those two, they are complicated. But I think the fundamental benefits of digitizing education will come when we start reimagining what it is to teach with technology as a platform. And for those of us who grew up in a much more analog way, it's hard for us to conceptualize. So that's sort of a comment that says maybe we need a little patience on this. I do have a question that's unrelated to Professor Caffo, so if I may. You had mentioned this issue of working with companies that are collecting this data. And there's a predicament, and I wonder if you or anybody else has any thoughts on this. These companies collect all of this data on how we use our phones, how we engage with Google and Twitter. And in order to work with them, it's very difficult to then do the analysis that shows that their product is very harmful, because they will probably not be excited about sharing the data the next time. So there's a very difficult problem here around incentives and honest research with these companies. Many of my colleagues who've tried to work with Facebook, for instance, have encountered this where they find a real problem and then Facebook says, please don't come back for future data. And that strikes me as a problem that probably needs some sort of a government intervention. But I wondered if people had thoughts about that. So one comment, and then I'd love any thoughts on any questions.
Thank you so much. Professor Caffo.
No, it's true that the company, but in the past, they utilized their own data. It was, they committed the research to universities and they take the data. Instagram story in the States was the symbol of this process. Now, something changed. They like to support independent research. They try to combine effort together. For example, Apple is working with Meta. It's complicated, but they try to face the issue of metaverse together, because the metaverse is a way in which all the companies have to work together. And I think in this case, our field of academic research had to be part of the process. And the problem is the quality of the research that we have to build, because the change in this area are so fast that we need very able people to understand the new process that can be happen. For example, we are working now with two companies in particular, because we created, starting from an event that we created in this building, we create a Child Dignity Alliance. The Child Dignity Alliance means a collaboration between companies, regions, and academic. And we worked, and this is what to answer today. We have a meeting in this building with Apple some months ago, because they try to create an area which the children can stay in a protected way, in some way, but they'll try to see how they can discuss with the people outside. And in this network, we found a company now more open to share ideas and to give to some of the data that they have about algorithms, for example. In this case, Europe is more advanced than the States, because we create at European level very strong action with the company, and we work a lot around the algorithm issue. Some company accept, other company, as Telegram, don't like to share any data. I think this is a big issue, but I think the future collaboration can be crucial.
Dr. Farley.
I'm not even sure how to phrase this question, but perhaps some of you in the room can address it. There are ethical and practical concerns about negotiating with multinational corporations about children's education. Many countries have nationalized important country resources, and that's an ongoing struggle, as we all know. Things like water, and well, water's the best example, because governments don't always take care of us when they take charge of water or forests. So my question is, who should be, in your ideal world as educators, public health people, who should be in charge of the internet, if not Mark Zuckerberg or the Congress of the United States? Thank you.
Jim?
Well, I can't answer that question, but I do want to follow up on something she said, because there is another possible explanation about productivity that's not quite as nice. And that is that when you add a great deal of technology, one of the things that can happen is you get a huge increase in productivity, but for a smaller and smaller group of highly trained people. The others being pushed into low-wage service sector, and then when you average them, you don't see anything. But what you've really done is to increase income disparities in a way that you probably don't like. So it's not clear from aggregate data what's really happened to productivity in that sense.
I would like to clarify the following. The phrase that you refer to is of Bob Solow, okay? But we have to be careful, because it was stated last century, at the time of the third industrial revolution. Today, we are at the fourth. In other words, he was not considering artificial intelligence, and he was referring to automation. But automation is totally different from artificial intelligence. So that is why that statement today is no longer true.
You're absolutely right, of course. And I wonder if it is no longer true. I mean, I still think even in this revolution, we still see many places where digitization, where even with artificial intelligence, it takes some time for real productivity gain. It's possible that there's an aggregate disaggregation issue as well. But I still think that even in today's age, so much of the benefit of technology is in reimagining work and reimagining the product and less about the digitization per se. I mean, I think that principle remains, though I agree with you, what Bob Salo was saying was about a different context. Yeah, yeah. It's such a nice line, though, that I love using it.
You're becoming French, Ashish. What matters is how nice it is conceptually, regardless of how the world works. Thank you so much, and we managed to stay on time. To our colleagues on Zoom, thank you. Thank you for your contributions. Thank you for staying with us, and you're embodying, you're performing the world we're all going to be living in, moving forward with your patience and your engagement and staying with us online. So thank you so much.